When I walked into that courtroom, I expected the usual sounds: the shuffle of papers, the low murmurs of lawyers, the heavy silence before a verdict. But when the judge lifted his eyes and saw me, the air itself seemed to freeze. His hand trembled, the pen slipped slightly, and for a moment the whole room forgot to breathe. I felt dozens of eyes turn toward me, but I only saw his expression. Recognition, disbelief, maybe even guilt. It was as if my presence had dragged an old memory back into the light. My palms rested on the cold table, my heart steady but my thoughts swirling. I had prepared myself for this day, but not for that look. My daughter wouldn't meet my gaze. Her husband sat beside her, smug and satisfied, convinced victory was already his. But something in the judge's silence told me the story wasn't over. Not yet. That day didn't begin in court. It began that morning in my kitchen. The scent of coffee filled the air, and I sat in my usual spot, the chipped mug warm in my hands. Outside, the sun had barely risen, painting the porch in soft gold. I spoke to my flowers as I always did, asking them to stay strong through another season. These small rituals grounded me, especially in recent months when the world around me had shifted into something I barely recognized. My daughter, once my pride, now visited rarely and always in haste. The warmth in her voice had cooled into formality. Her husband, Michael, controlled every word she said, every move she made. I used to think love was the language of giving. Give your time, your care, your heart, and it would bloom. But lately, I wondered if I had misunderstood what love required. Sundays used to be sacred. The smell of roast chicken filled the house, and laughter spilled across the table like sunlight. Those were the days when my daughter's head rested on my shoulder, when she told me about her dreams. Now she arrived with barely a smile, scrolling on her phone through dinner, eating little, saying less. My kitchen, once alive with noise, had turned into an echo chamber of memories. I tried to believe it was just stress, or her pregnancy making her tired, but deep down, I knew better. Her silence was not exhaustion, it was distance. And it frightened me more than I could admit. The first time I heard them talk about selling the house, I thought it was a joke. "It's too big for you, Mom," she said, eyes downcast. "It's just safer to simplify." But then strangers came, walking through my home with clipboards, speaking in numbers and percentages. They called my living room cluttered, my kitchen outdated, my bedroom impractical. They didn't see the life in these walls, the nights I spent rocking her to sleep, the handprint still faint on the banister my husband had polished every spring. I stood there, listening to them talk about my memories as if they were dust. My daughter avoided my eyes, and Michael just smiled, pretending it was kindness. But I knew. This wasn't love. It was control wrapped in concern. That night, the silence of the house was unbearable. I wandered into the study, a room I hadn't touched since my husband passed. His scent still lingered there, faint aftershave in old paper. My fingers brushed across his desk, and something compelled me to open the drawers. I found yellowed receipts, loose pens, nothing important, until I reached the back. There, hidden beneath layers of forgotten documents, was a small locked folder. I searched for the key, my heart pounding, until I finally found it taped beneath the drawer. When I opened it, the world shifted. Inside were property deeds, bank records, investment portfolios, all in my name. My husband had quietly secured everything for me. There were letters, too, one sealed in his familiar handwriting. His words were steady, filled with love and foresight. He had known the world could turn cruel, that even family could become strangers when money or control entered the room. He wrote that he trusted me to know when the time would come to stand up and protect what was mine. Reading that letter felt like hearing his voice again, strong and certain. I cried quietly, my tears soaking the paper, but beneath the grief, something long buried began to rise. Strength. For years, I had let myself shrink, apologizing for taking up space in my own life. But that night, I saw the truth. I wasn't powerless. I never had been. My husband's care had built a fortress I didn't even know I possessed. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back, but the decision had already settled in my bones. I would not argue. I would not beg. I would not shout. I would wait. Patience, not anger, would be my weapon. Silence, not pleading, would be my power. They thought they were moving me out, but soon I would show them who truly held the keys. The morning the movers came, the air outside was heavy with summer heat. Trucks lined the driveway. Michael strutted across the porch like a conqueror, barking orders while my daughter stood by, weary and silent. I sat in my chair by the window, hands folded, calm as still water. They expected a frail woman ready to surrender, but my bags were unpacked, my kitchen smelled of coffee, and my heart was steady. When Michael began to explain how this was for my own good, I let him speak until the words felt hollow. Then I rose, opened the folder, and laid it gently on the table. His smirk faltered. My daughter's breath caught. The movers paused mid-step. I spoke quietly, but every word landed like stone. The house was mine, and so was theirs. Every property, every investment. Mine by law, by name, by love that had outlasted his deceit. He laughed at first until I slid the documents toward him. Then the color drained from his face. My daughter's eyes filled with tears. The room fell silent except for the sound of my heartbeat, steady and sure. I had waited years for this silence, to let the truth speak louder than any argument. That was the day everything changed. But it was only the beginning, because soon this battle would leave my living room and find its way into a courtroom, and there, under the eyes of the law and the weight of truth, justice would finally stand with me. The day of the hearing arrived, cloaked in the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. The courthouse loomed tall and gray against the morning sky, its steps cold beneath my hands as I climbed them slowly, deliberately, refusing to be hurried. Inside, the air felt thick with tension. Lawyers murmured, papers rustled, and the hum of whispers filled the space. My daughter sat across from me, her eyes downcast, her hands clasped tightly together, as if praying for a version of this day that would never come. Beside her, Michael leaned back in his chair with that familiar smirk, the same one that had haunted my peace for years. He looked so sure of himself, so certain that his lies would carry him through. I had seen that confidence before, in men who believed their control was unshakable, in men who mistook kindness for weakness. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. His robe swept behind him as he took his seat, the gavel resting on polished wood. He glanced over the documents in front of him, then lifted his gaze. And then, for a single breathless moment, time stopped. His eyes met mine. He froze, just slightly, his pen slipping from his fingers before he caught it again. Confusion flickered across his face, followed by recognition. I watched him straighten in his chair, his expression shifting from professionalism to something softer, something that unsettled even the lawyers. I could feel the air change, feel the question ripple through the room. Why did the judge look at her that way? I didn't speak. I sat still, palms pressed against the cool surface of the table, my heart steady but alert. Michael shifted beside his attorney, irritation flickering across his face. My daughter looked at me for the first time in weeks, uncertainty shadowing her features. The judge cleared his throat, his voice slightly strained as he began the proceedings. But I could tell, somewhere in the back of his mind, a memory had awakened, and it carried weight. The arguments began, as expected. Michael's lawyer painted me as unstable, a bitter old woman unwilling to let go of control, clinging to a house too big for her and assets she didn't understand. He used words like manipulative, unfit, and unreasonable. Each one landed like a stone thrown across calm water, disturbing the surface but not sinking deep. I sat quietly, my face unmoved, the calm in my chest steady and deliberate. Let them speak, I thought. The truth has its own timing. When it was my lawyer's turn, he didn't start with a speech. He simply placed the folder, my husband's folder, on the table. The same one I had found hidden in the study months ago. He opened it carefully, laying out the deeds, the bank statements, the letters. The silence that followed was electric. The air seemed to hum with revelation as he spoke of my husband's foresight, the protections he had put in place, the ownership that had always been mine. Then came the messages, Michael's own words to my daughter, the threats and manipulation he thought no one would ever see. They unfolded like confessions written in ink. I watched as the judge leaned forward, studying every page, his expression unreadable. Michael's lawyer stammered, trying to object, but his words faltered. My daughter's face turned pale, tears brimming in her eyes as the evidence mounted. Piece by piece, their web of deceit began to unravel, and for the first time, I saw fear flicker in Michael's eyes. The confidence, the arrogance, it cracked, revealing the man beneath, small, desperate, cornered. Then, just as the final document was read, the judge set down his pen. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly, his eyes returning to me. "Mrs. Alden," he said softly, his voice carrying through the silence. "Do you remember a small diner off Maple Avenue?" About 30 years ago, the room froze. My breath caught. The memory surfaced instantly. The clatter of dishes, the hum of old music, the smell of coffee and fried eggs. I had worked there in my 30s, waiting tables through long nights to pay for my daughter's school supplies. One evening, a young man had come in, exhausted, studying casebooks between shifts at a warehouse. He couldn't afford the full meal, so I gave him one anyway. Slipped him an extra slice of pie, told him to keep going, that someday it would matter. And now, here he was, his eyes softened. "You were kind to me when you didn't have to be," he said quietly. "You told me once that good deeds echo farther than we ever see." He paused, looking directly at Michael. "Today, that echo has reached this courtroom." The silence that followed was absolute. My daughter pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Michael looked like he'd swallowed stone. The judge's next words came firm and final. He ruled in my favor, not just for the property, but for protection, for restitution, for peace. My daughter was granted security, her finances separated, and her husband's influence stripped away. The gavel came down with a sound that felt like release. I sat still for a moment, letting it wash over me. Then I rose, slowly, deliberately, meeting the judge's gaze with gratitude that needed no words. The courtroom began to stir, papers rustling, footsteps echoing, but I barely heard any of it. For the first time in years, I felt light. The weight of fear, of silence, of betrayal, it was gone. What replaced it was quiet strength. As I walked out of that courtroom, sunlight spilled through the tall windows, warm and bright against my face. My daughter followed behind me, hesitant but near, and though there were no words yet between us, I could feel it, the fragile beginning of healing. The weeks that followed the verdict felt almost dreamlike. The house, once filled with tension and shadows, now seemed to breathe again. I could walk through each room without the heaviness of doubt pressing down on me. The light poured through the windows differently, softer, warmer, as if the walls themselves understood that peace had finally returned. My daughter began visiting again, quietly at first, unsure of how to face me after everything that had happened. There was guilt in her eyes, the kind that lingers long after apologies are spoken, but I never needed her to say sorry. I only needed her to find her way back. At first, she stayed only a few minutes at a time, bringing groceries or paperwork she claimed I needed help with, but slowly those brief visits turned into longer afternoons. She started joining me on the porch again, where the garden bloomed with wild color, and the silence between us softened into something gentler. One afternoon, she came without her phone, her hands folded nervously in her lap. "Mom," she said quietly. I should have listened sooner. I looked at her, and for a moment I saw the little girl she used to be, the one who once ran barefoot across the yard, clutching a dandelion bouquet, promising she'd always take care of me someday. I reached for her hand and squeezed it gently. "You came back," I said. "That's all that matters." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they weren't born of fear. They were the kind that heal. From that day forward, something changed. We began rebuilding, not from the ruins of anger, but from the quiet understanding that forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It reclaims the future. Life didn't become perfect overnight. Healing rarely does. But the distance between us began to fade, replaced by small gestures that spoke louder than words. She helped me tend the garden again, laughing softly when the wind caught her hair like it used to. Sometimes she'd bring her favorite pastries and sit at the table where we used to share Sunday dinners, the same one she'd once ignored. And in those moments, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Months later, when her baby was born, I was there. I held my granddaughter for the first time in the hospital room, the morning light spilling through the blinds, her tiny fingers curling around mine. She was so small, so fragile, yet she carried the strength of every woman who came before her. I looked into her little face and whispered promises I'd once thought I'd never get the chance to make. "You'll always be loved," I murmured. "You'll always be safe." My daughter watched me, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Mom," she said softly, "I want her to know who you really are, everything you've done." I smiled at her and shook my head gently. "She doesn't need to know who I was," I said. "She just needs to feel what love is." Because I knew in that moment, the true legacy of a life well lived isn't measured by money or property. It's measured by how deeply our kindness survives after us. As the months passed, I began to feel a pull towards something larger than my own story. What I had endured, the betrayal, the manipulation, the slow erosion of dignity, wasn't just mine. So many women were living versions of the same pain, their voices swallowed by fear, their strength buried beneath silence. I couldn't undo the years I'd lost, but I could give meaning to the ones ahead. I decided to start a small foundation, a place for women like me, those who had been told they were too old, too weak, too dependent. A place where they could rebuild their confidence, learn their rights, find community, and remember that it is never too late to reclaim your life. I sold one of my husband's old properties and used the proceeds to fund the project. I named it The Second Light because that's what it felt like. The moment after darkness, when the sun rises and you realize the world hasn't ended after all. The first woman who walked through the doors reminded me of myself. Her eyes were weary, her shoulders hunched under invisible weight. She told me she hadn't slept properly in months, that her children no longer spoke to her, that she didn't know where she belonged. I sat with her, listened quietly, and said the same words my husband had once written to me. "You are not defenseless. You are not done. You are enough." Each story that followed carried its own heartbreak, but also its own rebirth. The women began to find strength in each other, their laughter returning, tentative at first, then brighter. The foundation grew slowly, but with heart. I poured everything I had left into it, time, care, and the quiet fire that had once fueled me through widowhood and betrayal. And in helping them heal, I found I was healing too. Years later, I sometimes drive past the courthouse. I see the tall steps, the familiar windows, and I think of that morning, the one where I walked in uncertain and left unbroken. I think of the judge who remembered a slice of pie from decades ago, and how kindness, no matter how small, has a way of circling back when we least expect it. I think of my daughter's laughter filling my house again, and of my granddaughter's tiny hand gripping mine. The truth is, every chapter of pain holds the seed of something new. Every betrayal, every silence, every loss, it's all a lesson written in the language of resilience. Dignity isn't something others grant us. It's something we guard, quietly, fiercely, until the day we finally remember who we've always been. If my story has touched you, let it be a reminder that you are never too old, too tired, or too broken to stand up again. Share this story with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, your strength, or your own journey. And remember, no matter how long the night lasts, there is always a second light waiting to rise.